The Unnoticed Princess and the Human Captain. The Grand Forum of the Stellar Alliance roared with the sounds of 100 species, each voice layered over the others in an endless clash of opinions. The chamber was a masterpiece of engineering. Its high vaulted ceiling, embedded with artificial starlight that mimicked the vastness of space. Towering figures moved through the grand hall, their long robes sweeping across the polished obsidian floor as deals were struck. Alliances were tested, and power was wielded in words sharper than any blade. Among them, barely noticed, stood Princess Lyra of the Skeelan Dominion. She was small, too small, according to the unspoken rules of the galaxy. At just under a meter in height, the princess of a once great people stood like a flickering ember among raging bonfires. The Skeela had been known as brilliant innovators, their technology once sought after by the greatest empires, but time had turned against them. Their small stature, once seen as a sign of agility and intellect, had instead become a mark of insignificance. Other species had grown larger, stronger, and more dominant in interstellar affairs, while the Skeela faded into the background like forgotten whispers of a bygone era. And now, Lyra stood at the edge of that obscurity, fighting against it. She wore the royal robes of her lineage, deep indigo woven with silver threads that shimmered like captured moonlight. A delicate crystalline crown adorned her head, catching the artificial glow of the chamber's lighting. She held herself with perfect posture, every inch of her presence crafted to exude grace and dignity. But no matter how poised she remained, she could feel the weight of countless dismissive glances pressing against her like an invisible tide. "The princess has arrived," a low voice murmured nearby, dripping with amusement. Lyra stiffened. She knew what was coming. "What a tragedy," the voice continued, laced with cruel mockery. "A princess no one wants." She turned her head slightly, her violet eyes catching sight of the speaker, a towering Orvian general, his skin the color of molten stone, his smirk filled with condescension. He wasn't alone. Several others had paused to watch, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright dismissal. Lyra did not react. She had mastered the art of swallowing pain. Her hands clenched beneath her flowing sleeves, nails pressing into her palms. She had no time for their mockery. This forum was her father's final attempt to ensure the Skeela's place among the Alliance, to remind the galaxy that they still mattered. She had been sent not just as royalty, but as a representative of her people's last hope. But hope felt fragile in a place where she was already deemed irrelevant. At the far end of the chamber, leaning casually against a marble column, a lone figure observed the scene with quiet intensity. Captain Marcus Hale, a human officer of the Earth Coalition. He stood apart from the politics of the chamber, his steel-blue eyes scanning the delegates with the practiced vigilance of a soldier who had seen far too much. Tall, broad-shouldered, and battle-hardened, he carried himself with an air of detached authority, his dark uniform pressed with crisp perfection. A thin scar ran along his jaw, a reminder of past conflicts that had shaped him into what he was today. Unlike the other diplomats and warriors in the room, Marcus was not here to negotiate. He was part of the diplomatic security force, ensuring that discussions didn't spiral into something more violent. He had attended dozens of these meetings, heard the same arrogant voices argue over the same tired power struggles. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, his gaze landed on her. At first, she was easy to overlook, smaller than the others, quieter, standing alone. But it wasn't her size that caught his attention. It was the way she stood, the way she held herself in a sea of giants who refused to acknowledge her presence. "Who's that?" Marcus murmured, glancing at the officer beside him. The man followed his gaze and chuckled. That's Princess Lyra of the Skeela, Galaxy's most irrelevant royal." "Irrelevant, yeah. No one wants them in the Alliance anymore. Too small, too weak. Their males aren't much taller than she is. But she's different. No one's interested in a Skeelan princess. Honestly, surprised she even bothers showing up." Marcus didn't laugh. He simply continued watching as Lyra stepped forward toward the center of the forum, toward the predators. A hush fell over the room as the princess took her place among them. She raised her chin, her voice steady despite the unspoken battle raging around her. "The Scala have long been part of the Alliance's history," she said, her words clear and precise. "We offer intelligence, technological advancements, and strategic insights unmatched by any other race. I ask only that my people be given a place in these discussions." Silence followed. Then, laughter. A Relaxian warlord, his spiked exoskeleton gleaming under the chamber lights, let out a harsh chuckle. "A place," he echoed mockingly. "What can a race of tiny shadows contribute that the great powers have not already mastered?" More laughter. Dismissal. Lyra did not flinch. She had expected this. She had prepared for this. Marcus, still watching, felt something stir within him. Something rare. Respect. He had seen warriors buckle under pressure far less than this. He had seen men and women, twice her size and with years of battle experience, fold when faced with the overwhelming force of ridicule. But she stood her ground. Alone. A single star burning in the endless void of space. Marcus exhaled slowly, pushing away from the column. "I think," he murmured to himself, "it's about time someone took her seriously." And with that, he moved. The unlikely ally. The silence that followed Princess Lyra's words was more cutting than any rejection. The chamber, once filled with lively political debates, had quieted, not out of respect, but out of sheer dismissal. The towering delegates of the Alliance barely acknowledged her presence, much less her argument. The Relaxian warlord, still chuckling at his own insult, turned away as if the matter had already been settled. A few others followed suit, shifting their attention to more important discussions. Deals, trade agreements, military alliances, all things that, in their eyes, mattered far more than the future of the Scala. Lyra remained where she was, her violet eyes steady, her small hands hidden in the folds of her royal robes. She had known this would happen. She had spent years watching her people being pushed aside, ignored, and rendered obsolete. She had prepared for ridicule, for rejection. But knowing something is inevitable doesn't make it easier to endure. Her father had sent her here with hope, the last fragile ember of it. The Scala, once pioneers of interstellar technology, had been fading into irrelevance for decades. They had no armies, no vast colonies, no military presence worth mentioning. Other species had outgrown them, literally and figuratively. And now, even their last bid to remain in the Alliance was being laughed out of the room. She felt the weight of their disregard pressing against her, suffocating and absolute. Then, a voice. Not hers. Not one of the towering delegates. A deep, firm voice that cut through the indifference like a blade. "I disagree." The chamber froze. Conversation stalled mid-sentence. Heads turned. Princess Lyra turned as well, her sharp gaze locking onto the speaker. Captain Marcus Hale. The human officer had stepped forward from where he had been leaning against the column, his uniform crisp and decorated with the insignia of the Earth Coalition. His steel-blue eyes swept the room, calm and unyielding. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't making a joke. He wasn't playing politics. He was challenging them. The Relaxian warlord's mandibles clicked in irritation. "You disagree?" he rumbled. "On what grounds?" Marcus didn't look at him. He kept his gaze on Lyra. "On the grounds that dismissing a people based on size alone is idiotic." A murmur spread through the crowd. The same species who had just ignored Lyra now turned their attention to Marcus, their curiosity piqued. Humans were relatively new to the Alliance, but their reputation was already becoming legendary. The Earth Coalition had proven itself unpredictable, both resourceful and stubborn, both diplomatic and terrifyingly aggressive when provoked. "Human," the Orvian general interjected, his deep voice edged with irritation. "This is a matter of strategic importance, not sentiment." "Exactly," Marcus countered. Which is why I find it strange that you'd ignore one of the most advanced technological races in the galaxy. The Scala practically pioneered half the ship designs you rely on. But because they don't take up enough space in a room, they're worthless. The Orvian's red eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by a human. Lyra, meanwhile, had barely moved. She stood still, studying the man before her. She didn't know why he had stepped in, but she wasn't about to squander the opportunity. She turned back to the council. "The captain is correct," she said, her voice steady but sharper now, stronger. "The Scala have been innovators for centuries. Our advancements have benefited every major power in this room. And yet, we are cast aside simply because we are not warlords or conquerors." She let her words settle. If the Stellar Alliance truly values strength above all else, then perhaps it is not as great as it claims to be. The weight of her words rippled through the room. This time, the laughter did not come. The Relaxian warlord's mandibles twitched. The Orvian general folded his arms, his muscles tightening with restrained irritation. The other delegates exchanged unreadable glances. For the first time that evening, Princess Lyra was no longer being ignored, and Marcus Hale had just made himself a target. The aftermath. The meeting continued, though the atmosphere had shifted. The outright dismissals had lessened, replaced by guarded skepticism. A few delegates still ignored Lyra, but others now watched her more carefully. Marcus had returned to his place near the edge of the chamber, but he wasn't alone anymore. Lyra approached him once the council session adjourned, her steps light but precise. Up close, Marcus could see the intricate silver embroidery in her robes, the fine craftsmanship of her delicate crown. But it was her eyes that held his attention. Deep violet, filled with intelligence and something colder, determination. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Didn't I?" Lyra studied him. "I don't understand. What do you gain by interfering in matters that don't concern you?" Marcus shrugged. "Maybe they do concern me." She narrowed her eyes slightly, but there was no hostility there, only curiosity. "The other humans didn't speak up," she pointed out. "That's because they've already learned the first rule of galactic politics," Marcus said. "Don't pick fights you don't need to. And yet, you picked one anyway." He smirked faintly. "Must be a character flaw." Lyra exhaled softly. Not quite a laugh, but something close. "You're an odd one, Captain Hale." "So I've been told." A brief pause. Lyra shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against the fabric of her sleeves. "Regardless," she said, her voice softer now. "Thank you." Marcus nodded once. He wasn't the type to bask in gratitude. "Don't thank me yet, Princess," he said. "You still have a long fight ahead of you." Lyra's gaze didn't waver. "I'm aware." Another pause. The sounds of the chamber were dying down as delegates dispersed. "You're different from the others," Lyra said suddenly. "In what way?" "Most people see my size first, my insignificance." Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "They're idiots," he said simply. Lyra blinked. It was the most blunt, direct response she had ever heard. "You don't see me that way?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Marcus tilted his head slightly, considering her. "I see a woman trying to hold her people together with nothing but words and willpower." Lyra wasn't sure why that sentence hit her so hard. She had been called weak, powerless, a relic of a dying race. But never this. Never strong. Before she could respond, Marcus straightened. "Walk with me, Princess." Lyra hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. As they moved through the grand halls of the Alliance Forum, side by side, the first whispers of an unlikely alliance had begun. A battle of words and wills. The grand halls of the Stellar Alliance Forum were eerily quiet at this hour. The towering columns of crystalline metal shimmered with faint energy, casting elongated shadows along the marble-like floors. It was a place meant to symbolize unity, but Lyra had never felt more isolated. She walked beside Marcus, their steps in sync, but their thoughts worlds apart. For the first time since she had arrived, someone had spoken up for her people. Someone who did not dismiss her because of her size, her race, or her lack of military power. Someone who saw her for what she truly was, a leader desperately trying to keep her people from fading into irrelevance. But she wasn't foolish enough to assume that meant he was on her side. "You're an anomaly, Captain Hale," Lyra said after a while. Marcus glanced at her, his steel blue eyes catching the dim glow of the corridor's floating lights. "I get that a lot." "I mean it," she continued. "Humans are still new to the Alliance, yet you understand its politics better than most." Marcus exhaled sharply, as if laughing at some private joke. Understanding politics and liking it are two very different things. Lyra hummed in agreement. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, "What do you want, Captain?" Marcus didn't slow his pace. "I thought that was obvious. I want to know why everyone here is so determined to ignore you." Lyra's expression didn't change, but something in her shoulders tensed. "You already know the answer to that." "Maybe," Marcus admitted, "but I want to hear you say it." Lyra let out a slow breath. "The Skila are small," she said, her voice even but cold. "Not just in stature, but in influence. Our empire never sought expansion, never built war fleets, never imposed our will upon others." She tilted her head slightly, studying the human beside her. "And in this galaxy, power is measured in weapons, not wisdom." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the biggest load of crap I've ever heard." Lyra stopped walking. She turned to face him fully, her violet eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Excuse me." Marcus turned as well, arms crossing over his broad chest. "I said that's crap," he repeated, unfazed by her sharp tone. "If the Skila weren't valuable, the others wouldn't be trying so hard to push you out." Lyra's fingers twitched against her sleeves. "They aren't trying to push us out. They're trying to erase us." Marcus's gaze sharpened. Lyra took a step closer. Though she barely reached his chest in height, her presence was just as fierce. "The Skila's technological advancements have benefited every major power in the Alliance," she said. "We were once at the heart of progress. But as new empires rose, our contributions became inconvenient. Others took credit for our work, absorbed our scientists, dismantled our research colonies." Her voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the quiet fury beneath it. "And now that they've taken all they can from us," she finished, "they no longer see a reason for us to remain." A silence settled between them. Then Marcus smirked. "That's even worse than I thought," he said. Lyra's eyes narrowed again. "You find this amusing?" "No," Marcus said simply. "I find it stupid." Lyra wasn't sure if she was more confused or irritated. "Explain." Marcus gestured vaguely. "They're getting rid of the very people who made them powerful. That's short-sighted as hell. And honestly, I've seen humans make the same mistake before. It never ends well." Lyra crossed her arms, mimicking his stance. "And what do you propose, Captain? That I challenge a warlord to single combat? That I intimidate them into respecting us?" Marcus chuckled. "That would be one hell of a sight. But no, that's not your style." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "And what is my style, Captain Hale?" Marcus's smirk faded into something more serious. "You fight with words, with knowledge, with the fact that, deep down, they know they still need you." Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line. "And if they refuse to admit it," Marcus exhaled, glancing down the corridor, "then you find someone who does." Lyra followed his gaze. The meeting had adjourned, but a few figures still lingered: delegates, officers, officials. Among them were those who had watched her during the session, those who had seemed less convinced of her irrelevance. "You're suggesting I divide them." "I'm suggesting you remind them that they're already divided," Marcus corrected. "Some of these people are just following the majority. They don't actually hate the Skila. They're just afraid of sticking their necks out." Lyra considered this. And you're not. Marcus smirked again. Oh, I stick my neck out all the time. Bad habit. Lyra exhaled through her nose. You truly are an anomaly, Captain Hale. You keep saying that like it's a bad thing. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back toward the lingering delegates. She had spent so long being ignored, dismissed, and pushed aside. But now, for the first time, she had an ally. A human one. Of all things. Very well, Captain, she said at last. Let's see just how much of an anomaly you really are. And with that, Princess Lyra of the Scylla took the first step toward changing the course of her people's fate. The gathering storm. Lyra stood at the center of the grand chamber, her violet eyes scanning the faces before her. The delegates from the various races of the Stellar Alliance sat in their designated sections, their expressions ranging from bored indifference to thinly veiled hostility. The Scylla were not invited to gatherings like these. She was an outsider among giants, a relic of a once great civilization that the galaxy had deemed irrelevant. But tonight, she would make them remember. Marcus Hale stood a few paces behind her, his presence more relaxed, yet undeniably watchful. The human captain had done something that no other diplomat or military leader had ever done for the Scylla. He had listened. Now it was time to see if anyone else would. Lyra adjusted the ornate silver band on her wrist, a ceremonial marker of her status. Then she spoke. We have all heard the rumors, she began, her voice calm, clear, and steady, that the Scylla are weak, that we are remnants of a past that no longer matters, that we have nothing to offer the future of the Alliance. A few murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some scoffed. Others leaned forward, intrigued. Lyra continued. And yet, even as I stand here, I see the influence of my people in every one of your civilizations. She lifted a hand, gesturing toward the towering Centauri delegate, his 4 luminous eyes locked onto her. The Centauri FTL systems that dominate interstellar travel, a direct evolution of Scylla physics. The murmurs grew louder. She turned her gaze toward the massive war-scarred form of a Drak-Thul general, his reptilian features impassive. The Drak-Thul plasma shielding, so effective against orbital bombardment, perfected by Scylla engineers over a century ago. More shifting in the seats, a few side glances. Lyra pressed on. Even the very power structures that govern this alliance were shaped by Scylla diplomats, and yet we are given no seat, no voice. A few of the lesser races, those with little more influence than her own, began nodding. They knew what it was like to be overlooked. She had their attention now. But she wasn't finished. You have stolen from us. You have taken what benefits you and discarded the rest. Her voice was sharper now, like a blade slipping free of its sheath. But the Scylla are not extinct. We are not relics, and we will not fade quietly into history. Silence. The weight of her words hung in the air. Then, and what would you have us do about that, Princess? The voice came from High Chancellor Orvik, the ruling figure of the Alliance. His elongated, golden-skinned form sat atop the highest dais, his expression unreadable. This was it. The true battle. Lyra inhaled slowly. Give us what is owed, she said. Recognition. Representation. The chance to reclaim our place in this galaxy. Orvik tilted his head, his 6 fingers steepling before him. And if we refuse? Lyra's fingers twitched at her sides, but she did not break her composure. Before she could speak, Marcus stepped forward. Then the Alliance will be making the biggest mistake in its history, he said, his voice cutting through the chamber like a whip. All eyes turned to him. He smiled slightly. Not a friendly smile. Not a diplomatic one. A human smile. Because the one thing humans have learned about history, Marcus continued, is that when you push people to the brink, when you take everything from them and expect them to accept it, well, that never ends well for the ones doing the pushing. His words were casual, but there was an undeniable threat beneath them. Lyra studied the faces before her. Some of the delegates looked concerned. Others looked angry. But most of all, they looked uncertain. Good. For the first time in decades, the Skila were not being ignored. Lyra turned her gaze back to Orvik, her expression calm, yet unyielding. "This is not a request, High Chancellor," she said. "This is a warning." The silence that followed was deafening. The spark of defiance. The Grand Chamber stood frozen in absolute silence, the weight of Lyra's words pressing down on the gathered delegates like an invisible force. The High Chancellor's golden eyes flickered with something unreadable, perhaps amusement, perhaps annoyance. Marcus Hale remained at Lyra's side, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his stance deceptively relaxed. But his steel-blue eyes watched everything, tracking the subtle shifts in body language among the various alien dignitaries. Some looked uneasy, some looked angry, and a few, the most dangerous ones, looked calculating. The silence stretched. Then Orvik finally spoke. "A warning, you say?" His voice was smooth, measured. His long, slender fingers tapped against the armrest of his ornate seat. "That is an interesting word for a species with no military, no allies, and no significant presence in the galactic sphere." Lyra did not flinch. "We may not have a military fleet," she admitted. "We may not command legions of soldiers or dreadnoughts that blot out the stars. But the Skila have something far more valuable." Orvik's golden brow arched slightly. "And that is?" Lyra let a slow, knowing smile touch her lips. "Leverage." A ripple of hushed murmurs coursed through the chamber. Marcus almost grinned. "That's my girl." Orvik leaned forward just slightly, intrigued despite himself. "Elaborate." Lyra clasped her hands in front of her, her posture composed, regal. She let the silence build, letting them lean in, letting them wonder. Then she spoke. "The technological foundations of your civilizations were built on Skila innovations. Our advancements in quantum computation, our breakthroughs in energy refinement, our mastery of gravitational lensing. These were not mere contributions. They were the foundation upon which your fleets, your industries, and your infrastructures were constructed." A delegate from the Centauri, his bioluminescent skin flickering erratically, a sign of nervousness among his kind, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What are you implying, Princess?" he asked. Lyra's violet eyes gleamed. "I am stating a fact," she replied. "The Skala may not have warships, but we still have minds. We still have knowledge, and we know precisely how fragile the systems that uphold your galactic empire truly are." A deeper murmur swept through the room, this one tinged with concern. "Are you threatening sabotage?" One of the Drakthul generals rumbled, his slit-pupilled eyes narrowing. Lyra tilted her head. "Why would I do such a thing?" she said innocently. "I am merely pointing out the precarious nature of the Alliance's current technological dependencies. If the Skila are ignored, discarded, allowed to fade into obscurity, then so too will our knowledge. I wonder, how long before your ships begin to fail, your power grids destabilize, your planetary shields flicker and collapse?" More shifting, more nervous glances. Marcus was impressed. The princess had found the pressure point. Orvik's gaze darkened just slightly. "You expect us to believe you would allow your own knowledge to be lost, that your people would sabotage the very systems they helped build?" Lyra let out a soft sigh, as if disappointed by his lack of foresight. "Not sabotage, Chancellor," she corrected. "Irrelevance, if you do not recognize us. If you do not restore our place in the Alliance, then the Skila will have no reason to share our advancements with you any longer. And without us, your empire will stagnate." A sharp inhale came from one of the smaller alien delegates, one from a race that had suffered under the weight of the larger, more dominant species. They saw it now. The power had never truly belonged to the muscle-bound warlords or the towering bureaucrats. It had always belonged to the minds that created, and the Skila had always been the architects of the future. Orvik's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming against his throne-like chair. He did not like being cornered, but he also was not a fool. A kingdom could survive without soldiers. It could not survive without engineers. Silence stretched once more. Then, Orvik leaned back into his seat, his expression unreadable. "You make an intriguing argument, Princess Lyra." His tone was measured. "I will take it under advisement." Lyra did not move. "You misunderstand, Chancellor." Her voice was soft, but unwavering. "This is not a request. This is the moment in which you decide whether the Stellar Alliance thrives or withers." A long, heavy pause. Then, without another word, Lyra turned and walked away. Marcus fell into step beside her. "That went well," he muttered. Lyra let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Did it?" Marcus grinned. "Oh yeah," he said. "They're terrified." And they had every reason to be. Because a storm was brewing, and for the first time in centuries, the Scylla were at its center. The storm breaks. The moment Princess Lyra and Marcus stepped out of the grand chamber, the weight of the confrontation lingered like a phantom pressing against their shoulders. The towering crystalline spires of the Galactic Council's citadel loomed around them, refracting the cold artificial light of the station into fractured rainbows. The polished floors beneath their feet carried the faintest tremors, either from the colossal engines keeping the station in geostationary orbit, or from the seismic shift that had just taken place within the chamber they left behind. Marcus walked beside her, his presence steady and unwavering. He had seen this kind of political game before, on Earth, in the chaos of war, in backroom negotiations where the balance of power shifted on a single breath. "They'll try to stop you," he murmured. Lyra's violet eyes flickered up at him. "They already have." Marcus exhaled sharply, scanning the corridors ahead. He had expected the Council's reaction to be cautious, measured, uncertain, but something in Orvik's expression, in the way the delegates had exchanged glances, unsettled him. This wasn't just resistance. It was fear, and fear made people dangerous. As they walked, Lyra's personal guards, two Scylla scientists who had once been diplomats, flanked them, their expressions tense. "Princess," one of them, Zephyr, whispered, "we have a problem." Lyra paused. "What kind of problem?" Zephyr hesitated, then pulled up a holo display on his wristband. The glowing interface projected a map of the Council's citadel, and several red warning indicators flickered along their escape routes. "Security teams have been deployed," he said. "They've locked down all exits leading to the Scylla envoy ships." Marcus's hands curled into fists. "They're trying to keep us from leaving." His voice was calm, but Lyra could hear the growing edge beneath it. Zephyr's expression darkened. "It's worse than that," he said. "They've also restricted all long-range communications. We're being cut off from the outside." For the first time since the council meeting, Lyra felt a flicker of uncertainty. "They wouldn't dare attack us here," she said, though her words were more to herself than anyone else. Marcus didn't look convinced. "Princess, you just told them their empire is built on borrowed knowledge, and that if the Scylla withdraw from the galactic stage, their civilizations will collapse." His voice was low. "They know that if word of this spreads, the balance of power shifts permanently." Lyra clenched her jaw. Orvik wasn't going to take this loss quietly. "Then we'll find another way out." Marcus exhaled. "That's the problem, Your Highness." The guards at the far end of the corridor had shifted their stance, no longer standing idly by. They were blocking the exits, and their hands were on their weapons. A desperate gambit. A cold silence filled the hallway. "They won't let us leave," Zephyr whispered. "They're going to detain us until the council decides what to do with you." Lyra's mind raced. The Scylla had no standing army, no warships to call upon. If they were captured, there would be no daring rescue, no military intervention. The only way out was through. Marcus took a slow step forward. His stance was casual, But Lyra saw the subtle shift in his weight, the way his hands loosened just slightly, the way his breathing steadied. She knew that stance. He was preparing for violence. "Not yet," Lyra murmured. Marcus didn't look at her, but his jaw flexed. "Princess, if we wait too long, we won't get another chance." Lyra nodded, but her mind was already working. The Scala had never relied on brute force. They had built their influence on something far more subtle, something far more dangerous. Their knowledge. "Zephyr, what's the fastest way to disable their security network?" Zephyr blinked. "You want to? Just answer the question." The scientist hesitated. "The primary security relay is built into the station's neural AI core. If we introduce a cascading overload into the quantum lattice, in simpler terms, we can shut down all electronic locks, comms, and surveillance for 5 minutes." Marcus grinned. "That's all I need." Zephyr swallowed. I can do it, but we'll need access to a secure console." Lyra turned, scanning the hall. Then her eyes landed on a console terminal built into the wall. "Will that do?" Zephyr paled. "That's a diplomatic access panel. If we tamper with that, they already see us as a threat," Lyra said firmly. "If we're going to act, we act now." Zephyr inhaled sharply, then moved toward the console. His fingers flew over the interface. The guards at the end of the hall noticed. One of them stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Princess Lyra, you are ordered to stand down and remain in custody until further notice." Marcus moved, faster than any of them expected. One moment he was standing at Lyra's side. The next, he was on them. A sharp, brutal strike to the first guard's throat, a quick twist of his wrist to disarm the second, before his foot slammed into the gut of a third. The remaining guards hesitated, stunned. Marcus turned, his expression cold. "If you touch the princess, I'll break your bones." Lyra didn't waste a second. "Zephyr?" Almost. A final keystroke. The lights flickered. The entire station shuddered. And then, everything went dark. Escape. In the chaos of the blackout, Lyra grabbed Marcus's wrist and ran. Alarms wailed in the distance as emergency power struggled to restore control. Doors unlocked at random, security systems crashed, and the council's carefully maintained order shattered. The guards scrambled behind them, but Marcus was a force of nature. Any who got too close met swift, surgical violence. Their destination was clear, the Scala envoy ship. Lyra's heart pounded. She had challenged the entire Galactic Council. And now, they were running for their lives. But as she sprinted through the dimly lit corridors, Marcus at her side, she felt something unexpected. Not fear, not despair, but exhilaration. Because for the first time in centuries, the Scala were no longer bowing. They were fighting back. The breaking of chains. The moment the emergency lights flickered back on, the entire station lurched. Lyra felt the floor tremble beneath her as the distant thrum of energy weapons firing echoed through the corridors. The sound was muffled, but unmistakable. A battle had begun. Zephyr's virus had worked, throwing the security network into chaos. But the Galactic Council was too vast, too entrenched to be truly crippled by one breach. It had bought them minutes, nothing more. And now, the storm had arrived. Marcus pulled Lyra forward, his grip firm but not forceful. Even now, he moved with purpose, his sharp eyes scanning every corridor, every possible ambush point. The docking bay, Zephyr panted as he ran beside them. "It's just ahead." But Marcus had already stopped. His body went still, his gaze locked on the entrance to the hangar. Lyra followed his stare and felt her stomach drop. They were waiting for them. A full squadron of council enforcers, clad in dark metallic armor, their visors gleaming under the emergency lights. Their weapons hummed with barely restrained plasma energy, trained directly at her and Marcus. At their center stood Orvik. His robes, once pristine, were slightly askew. his expression dark with something close to desperation. "Princess Lyra," he said, his voice cool. "You have made a mistake." Lyra stepped forward, keeping her chin high. "The only mistake I made was believing that this council valued truth over control." Orvik exhaled slowly, as if disappointed. "The truth is not what holds the galaxy together, Your Highness. Order does." Marcus let out a sharp breath. "Order?" he repeated. "You mean stagnation, submission, theft." Orvik didn't look at him. His eyes remained locked on Lyra. "You do not understand the forces you are unleashing," he said. "If you go through with this, if you abandon the council, the galaxy will fracture. Civilizations will collapse. Wars will begin." Lyra's pulse was hammering, but her voice was steady. "Then let them." The words struck like a thunderclap. For a long moment, Orvik simply stared at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. "So be it." And he gave the order. "Take them." The stand of a human warrior, the first enforcer moved fast. But Marcus was faster. Before the soldier could level his weapon, Marcus had already closed the distance. His foot slammed into the enforcer's knee, sending the soldier crashing down. The plasma rifle was wrenched away a moment later, its power cell ripped free before Marcus slammed the weapon into the next attacker's throat. A second enforcer raised a shock baton. Marcus caught his wrist, twisted, and a crackling weapon was sent spinning away. Lyra barely had time to process it. The guards outnumbered him. They were trained, elite. But they weren't him. Marcus moved with the precision of a scalpel, the force of a wrecking ball. 1, 2, 3. Within seconds, 5 enforcers were on the ground, groaning. But more were coming. "Lyra." Marcus's voice was sharp. "Go." Lyra's heart clenched. "Not without you." Marcus turned, his breath heavy. "I'll hold them. Get to the ship." And then he was moving again, a blur of motion, as the next wave of enforcers swarmed. Lyra hesitated. She had never run away from a fight, but she knew Marcus was right. If she fell here, the dream of Skila independence died with her. "Zephyr, with me." They ran. The leap to freedom. The Skila envoy ship loomed ahead, sleek and curved like a silver crescent. Its engines hummed to life as automated systems detected her approach. The boarding ramp was already lowering. "We're almost there," Zephyr gasped. A blaster shot seared the air past her head. Lyra spun just in time to see another squad of enforcers rushing forward. She had seconds. She reached for the small pulse pistol at her side. She had rarely used a weapon before. Skila had no army, no soldiers. But at that moment, she wasn't a diplomat. She was a fighter. She lifted the pistol, aimed, and fired. The first enforcer went down stunned. The others hesitated just long enough. Lyra and Zephyr lunged up the ramp. "Go," Lyra shouted. The ship's AI recognized her voice. The ramp sealed shut. Outside the viewport, she could see Marcus still fighting. Alone. Her breath caught. "We have to help him." "We can't," Zephyr said. His voice was pained, but firm. Lyra's hands curled into fists. The ship rumbled. Engines flared. And then, they were rising. The council's station shrank beneath them. Marcus was still down there, fighting. But they had escaped. And the war had begun. Epilogue. The spark of rebellion. Hours later, Lyra stood on the bridge of the Skila vessel, staring at the endless stretch of stars. Behind her, Zephyr approached, his expression tense. "Word is spreading," he said. "The council is trying to control the narrative, but it's not working." Lyra turned. "What do you mean?" Zephyr swallowed. "Your speech. Your declaration. It was broadcast across the entire galactic network." Lyra's heart stopped. "How?" "Marcus," Zephyr said softly. "Before we lost contact, he uploaded it." Lyra felt her breath shake. Marcus was still down there. And yet, his actions were already reshaping the galaxy. Zephyr handed her a datapad. "You need to see this." Lyra hesitated, then activated the display. A map of the galaxy appeared, with blinking signals, distress calls, uprisings. One by one, planets across the Council's domain were declaring independence. The revolution had already begun. Lyra's fingers clenched around the datapad. "Prepare a transmission," she said. Zephyr looked at her. "To who?" Her violet eyes gleamed. "To everyone." The Council had ruled in the shadows for too long. It was time to bring them into the light.